So what did I want to do today? I wanted to give you a full comprehensive guide to the Demogorgons, mainly because I don't know, I have nothing else going on. Also, if you want to know all about the Russian Demogorgons, as well as have a lot of the questions about them answered, stick around to the end of the video. The Demogorgons are named after the D&D character from D&D, which is obviously named Jonathan. I mean, the Demogorgon. The Demogorgon, also known as the Prince of Demons, is one of the most powerful demon lords with 2 heads and long tentacles for arms. In order to better understand the Demogorgon species we see roaming Hawkins in the Upside Down, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. Okay, not that far back. Not the beginning of time. I meant more like the beginning of the Demogorgon's life cycle. Assuming that the Demodog and the Demogorgon are the same species, it appears that the Demogorgon has 6 stages to its life cycle. So in no order in particular, here's stage 1. We call this stage the larva stage, mainly because the Demogorgon is a larva at this point. At birth, the Demogorgon looks like this little slug guy right here. The Demogorgon larva is implanted in a host using a tendril. The tendrils, or vines, operate like fast-growing weeds, but also behave like animals. The vines cover the Upside Down, and are part of the hive mind belonging to Vecna. The vines could come from anywhere within the Upside Down, or from a meat-filled recreation of the Mind Flayer. It seems that the main purpose of these tendrils is to restrain Vecna's victims, then give birth to and distribute the Demogorgon larva into the victim. In 1983, the first sighted Demogorgon, also known as the Monster, took Will Byers and Barbara Holland into the Upside Down. This is where the Monster hooked Will and Barb up to these tendrils to put the Demogorgon larva into the both of them. Will would carry the larva inside of him until he coughed it up, and after Barbara died, the larva is seen exiting her mouth. Will's larva was a lot smaller than Barb's because Will wasn't hooked up to the tendril until the last day he was in the Upside Down. Further down the line in the year 1985, Eleven was struck with a tendril from the meat-filled Mind Flayer and injected with the same kind of Demogorgon larva. It was just like the human meat equivalent of that larva. Once the larva leaves or is yeeted out of its host, it then grows to stage 2, the Pollywog, named after the life cycle of a frog, where the tadpole gains a pair of legs. But unlike the frog, the Demogorgon's legs grow in the front while the frog's grow in the back. Then we're already moving on to stage 3, advanced Pollywog. This is where the Pollywog grows another pair of legs, this time on the back. The tail stays on, and the creature still only has a mouth and no face. The Pollywog's skin also changes to this green color for some reason. Now we're at stage 4, the Demodog stage. The Pollywog grows to the point where it starts looking like the Demogorgon we know and love, as the Pollywog becomes less like a frog on a log and more like a dog, hence the name Demodog. The mouth divides into these 5 parts that are lined with teeth, and when open, they resemble something like a Patrick Star. Then we advance to stage 5, Demodog 2.0. This is the furthest along we've ever seen a Demodog grow. The Demodog loses the green color and its skin turns white/gray. And ladies and gentlemen, we still got the tail. Stage 6 is when you can finally knock the training tail out of existence, because we finally arrived. The final stage in that little Pollywog's life cycle, the Demogorgon stage. This is where the creature loses its tail for balance because it can now stand on 2 feet like a human. The Demogorgon previously being a Demodog also adds reasoning as to why its arms are as long as its legs. This also explains why it alternates between standing on all 4s or standing on 2 legs. And if there is a 7th stage, I'm assuming it's death. The Demogorgons are definitely the predators of the Upside Down. On top of their raw strength and skin that's able to deflect bullets, the Demogorgon can smell blood from a pretty far distance, like a shark tracking its prey. In fact, in this 2016 Entertainment Weekly interview with the Duffer Brothers discussing the Demogorgon, they went on to say that we don't want to reveal too much other than say that it's an interdimensional being that has more in common with the shark from Jaws than Pennywise from It. When the monster enters our dimension, it's like a shark breaching the water. Very much like a shark, it drags its prey back into its home, where it feeds. The 1983 Demogorgon that was haunting Hawkins had the capability of interdimensional travel. It didn't necessarily need a gate, instead it pulled a Freddy Krueger and broke through the walls. But when the Demogorgon created gates, it created smaller ones, like this little Keebler Elf doorway in the middle of the woods. And speaking of feeding, the Demogorgon's diet can consist of deer, whatever the f this thing is, Dustin Henderson's cat, as well as nougat. I have something really interesting to add to the whole nougat thing, but we're gonna come back to that in a second. At first, I thought it was kind of odd to name named this creature after this demon from D&D. For example, our Demogorgon has no face or eyes. The D&D Demogorgon has like 2 faces and 4 eyes. Our Demogorgon also one-ups the D&D Demogorgon because it's roughly 9 feet tall, which is 1 foot taller than the D&D version. The Demogorgon also doesn't have 2 tentacles for arms, but they ended up being really similar towards the end. Let me explain. First of all, the D&D Demogorgon has those long tentacles for arms, similar to the tendrils that distribute the Demogorgon larva. In 1979, Vecna first enters the Upside Down, where he sees a Demogorgon just hanging out, doing its own thing, you know, being a 9 foot tall predator. This shows us that Vecna didn't create these creatures, like how he reshaped the particles into the Mind Flayer. Vecna flayed the minds of the Demogorgons the same way that he ended up flaying the minds of the citizens of Hawkins in the year 1985. He made all these Demogorgons conform to the hive mind, aka having them fall under the curse of Vecna, meaning the Demogorgons have 2 minds controlling the same body, just like the 2-headed Demogorgon. Now back to the nougat. When following Vecna's career, we see that every time he flays someone's mind, there's a chance for that victim to come back. Take Billy for example. Eleven was able to reach through to Billy by reminding Billy of that one memory of him and his mom at the beach. After reliving that memory, Billy was able to snap out of the curse of Vecna and fight the Meat Mind Flayer. Dart being a Demogorgon that was part of the attack on Hawkins meant that Dart was clearly under the curse of Vecna. When Dart was a little Pollywog, Dustin Henderson fed a product placement, specifically a chocolate bar that was mainly nougat. Then later on, Dustin runs into Dart when Dart's a full-on Demodog. During this encounter, Dustin gives the creature another product placement chocolate bar. At first, I was thinking that Dart only cared about enjoying that sweet, sweet product placement, but then he gives Dustin this look. This is a stretch, but I think the product placement had the same effect on Dart as the beach memory did on Billy, as the chocolate bar was something associated with Dart's childhood. The taste or the smell of the product placement could have temporarily broke the hold that Vecna had over Dart, which is why Dart took the time to look back at Dustin and not attack him and his friends. So now we know that the Demogorgon has emotions and the ability to care. So how do we kill it? How do you defeat the Demogorgon? If you're someone like 11, you can just use your telekinetic abilities to banish the monster to the Upside Down. But for us normal, less superpowered people, we have to rely on more conventional methods. It's almost pointless just to shoot at it because, as we all know by now, the Demogorgon's skin is practically bulletproof. However, if you can land a bullet inside the mouth of the Demogorgon, then you have a very high probability of killing it. There's also good old fire. You guys remember fire from the early Stone Age? It seems that everything in the Upside Down hates fire, or any heat for that matter. In 1984, Hawkins' lab primarily used fire to delay Eleven's gate to the Upside Down from spreading into Hawkins. And the Demogorgons have the same exact fire intolerance, which is why it severely bothers me that in 1983, Jonathan Byers extinguished the Demogorgon after successfully setting it on fire. It's like, bruh. It's gonna die, and who cares about the house? It's already trashed. I feel like the main reason Jim Hopper was able to cut off the head and arm of a Russian Demogorgon was because it was still connected to that hive mind. And at that point, Murray Bauman went scorched earth on all the Demodogs, Steve Harrington and Robin Buckley went scorched earth on Vecna, as Nancy Wheeler just kept shotgunning him. 11 also mentally put Vecna in his place. All of this weakened Vecna, which subsequently weakened the Demogorgon. Anyway, it's implied that the Russians over in Russia have been spying on the United States and learned about the Upside Down somehow. Ever since then, the Russians have been trying to access this other dimension. In 1985, the Russians were trying to build a gate to the Upside Down in Hawkins, and in 1986, Jim Hopper and friends discovered that the Russians were somewhat successful when it came to accessing this other dimension, as they were keeping native creatures of the Upside Down in these tanks within this isolated prison, and feeding inmates to this one creature in particular that is now known as the Russian Demogorgon. The prison feeds the creature these prisoners to keep the predator entertained, otherwise it will stop eating. It's unknown how exactly the Russians obtained these Demogorgons. The only logical explanation is that these puppies came from the Russians' time experimenting with their own gates. Seeing that the Demogorgons were contained in a lab where a bunch of scientist dudes were working, it appears that the prison was primarily used as a place to conduct this scientific research on the Demogorgons. The Russians must have had this goal of eventually weaponizing the creatures. But here's where it gets like really interesting. Remember back in 1984 when Will Byers got possessed by the Mind Flayer, aka the Curse of Vecna, and then Joyce Byers and friends had to use a bunch of heat to get Vecna out of him, and then when they were successful at doing that, a bunch of particles launched out into the world. Well, that is exactly what the Russians did to the Demogorgons. They performed a Vecna exorcism on them, as they used heat to free the creatures from Vecna's control, while at the same time using heat to contain the particles. It wasn't until the particles were released that the Demogorgons rejoined the hive mind, meaning the reason the first encounter with the Russian Demogorgon was so brutal was because that was the full, raw, unadulterated nature of the Demogorgon without Vecna's control holding it back. I know some of you out there may be like, whoa, hey, whoa. Wait a second. If the Demogorgon from 1983 was able to like burst through walls and make portals into our world, then how come the Russian Demogorgon wasn't able to use the same ability and break out of the Russian prison? We know that the particles were contained and imprisoned within the lab, so these Demogorgons weren't under the control of Vecna until they were broken out, meaning the Demogorgon must only gain this interdimensional traveling ability while under Vecna's control, as it seems that access to the Upside Down is heavily reliant on someone like Vecna or Eleven's presence. In 1985, the Russians were failing at opening their own gates in Russia because they were needing to operate from Hawkins, which is why they ended up choosing the Starcourt Mall. Which makes sense because that's where Eleven spent most of her time, and Vecna technically never left Hawkins. Demogorgons are pretty rad. That was the video. Thanks for watching.